Hello, everyone, and welcome. We are going to get our lawn chat started. Thank you all so much for coming today. My name is Allie Corey, and I am really excited and lucky that I get to be the new production coordinator for the Summer Music Institute, formerly known as the Summer Music Workshop. And I clearly am not R.L. Rousey, which is a great disappointment. I know, even to myself. The fact that I'm not R.L., it's something to aspire to. But he asked me to tell you to continue to spread the word that we are now live streaming the lawn chats. So that means that if you wait in line to get a seat in the pavilion and you really like your seat and you don't want to leave, you can pull out your tablet or your phone or whatever and go to svsummersymphony.org and go to the events page, and then you can watch it from wherever it is that you are. Or if you saw a concert previously that you want to know more about, by about noon the following day, all of the live chats are available online, and you can go and listen to Samir's dulcet tones explain to you all sorts of exciting things about what the concert was about. And it is my great honor to introduce our associate conductor, Samir Patel.
Thank you, Allie. Good evening, everybody. It's great to see you all. And we're already at that point in the season where we're starting the final countdown to the last concert. So I hope you've enjoyed the performances so far, and I know you're going to enjoy the performance tonight. It's such an extraordinary work that we're going to take a look at. The work is called Ein Heldenleben, A Hero's Life by Richard Strauss. And it's always an event to perform a big tone poem by Strauss. And I know here at the Sun Valley Summer Symphony, his name has come up over the past few years. The work that we're going to hear tonight closed the first season in the pavilion, in 2008, which is why it's on the programming for this season 10 years later. As we've discovered over the course of the past few weeks, some of the other works that were also on that first season, including Fanfare for the Common Man and Hymn to the Sun, and several others, have all been part of this 10-year celebration season. So, like I said, experiencing a Strauss tone poem in all of its grandeur and glory is always an event, and certainly tonight promises to be an extraordinary concert. So, the name Richard Strauss is probably familiar to you. He was born in 1864, and he died in 1949, and I love that he lived not only such a long life, but he lived an incredibly full life as well. If you just think historically, growing up in Germany and the time of the Kaiser, and then World War I and World War II, all the things he must have seen, not only historically, but also in terms of musical development itself. I mean, when he was born, Wagner was king, Brahms was still writing music, Mahler started to conquer Vienna, not too far from where Strauss grew up in Munich, and then, of course, after World War I, all what I call the isms start. Chromaticism, atonality, Dadaism, you name it. All those things found a way. All those movements found a way to incorporate themselves into music. And so Strauss lived during an amazing time period. And I thought I'd just start by sharing a quote by Arnold Schoenberg, who we all sort of identify as a revolutionary composer, the one who invented the 12-tone system. Those of you that don't like music that gets particularly thorny at times, Schoenberg was kind of the one that started that trend a little bit. But Schoenberg said, I was never revolutionary. The only revolutionary in our time was Richard Strauss, which definitely puts him in interesting context. Now, Strauss grew up as the son of the principal horn player of the court opera in Munich. And so Strauss studied music with his father, but even more important than that, he got his first experiences with music and studied music not in a music school or in a conservatory, but in probably the best laboratory for professional music making, which was watching his father's rehearsals. And so he would go to see his father playing in the opera, and he heard Wagner for the first time at age 10. He heard Lohengrin. His father hated Wagner's music and wanted to make sure that the young Richard Strauss didn't follow along those footsteps, as was pretty much what every young composer was doing. They were imitating Wagner at that time. But Strauss's father really wanted him to model himself after Schumann, who he thought was the great ideal, the one that blended classicism and romanticism and kept the great attributes of both of those genres within his own music. But so Strauss actually started his compositional uh, development as a young man by writing two symphonies. And those are, I have never in my professional career or student career before that encountered a performance of a Strauss symphony. That is because he eventually turned towards a new direction as a composer in his 20s, which was the development of the symphonic tone poem. Now, tone poem has its roots in the music of Berlioz, Liszt, and Wagner. This is music that is not considered a symphonic piece from the symphony standpoint. I remember a few concerts ago we were talking about that in regards to Brahms. Brahms wrote classical symphonies, structured symphonies. Also at the same time, other composers were developing what's called program music. And this is music that essentially tells a story of some sorts. Either a story from a book or a story about a famous person's life or a legend. And so Strauss started writing tone poems, and his first go at it was on the great Shakespearean character Macbeth. But after Macbeth, which was kind of him dipping his toes in the water, he wrote this piece. That piece, if you've heard it before, is his tone poem Don Juan, written when he was 24 years old. Now, can you imagine? That is the statement of a 24-year-old. You can almost hear the arrogance and brashness in that music itself. I don't think of it so much as the arrogance of Don Juan. I think of that as the arrogance and cockiness and confidence of a young Richard Strauss. And what you hear in that poem, and then just that minute of music that I played from Don Juan, is complete mastery. This is like I've thrown a couple of tennis analogies in our talks in the past. This is like Roger Federer just walking out for the first time and destroying Pete Sampras, at Wimbledon. This is just one of those moments where he is saying to the world, "I'm a big deal." And so Strauss wrote that music you just heard at the age of 24, and that was sort of what catapulted him into fame. And from there on, other works, tone poems came about. You've heard of Till Eulenspiegel. I'm sure Till Eulenspiegel's Merry Pranks. Also sprach Zarathustra. Those of you that were at the family concert the other night heard me conduct the opening minute of it. You know it, of course, as the music from 2001: A Space Odyssey. And also Don Quixote for cello and viola, and orchestra, of course. And these are some of the great symphonic pieces, all written when Strauss was still a young man. So, by 1898, he got to work on the piece that we're going to hear tonight, called Ein Heldenleben, a hero's life. And Strauss was referring to this piece, essentially, when he decided to call the piece A Hero's Life. Sorry, hang on. recognize that, of course, Beethoven's Eroica Symphony. Eroica, same meaning, hero. And so Strauss said about this piece we're going to hear tonight, as Beethoven's Eroica is so very unpopular with our conductors, and therefore seldom performed these days, I am now composing a great tone poem entitled Ein Heldenleben, in order to meet a pressing need. True, there is no funeral march, but it's in E-flat major and has lots of horns, which are, of course, well-versed in heroism. Heroism that describes the inward battle of life and aspires through effort and enunciation towards the elevation of the soul. So he wrote this piece called Ein Heldenleben. It's about 45 to 50 minutes long, and it starts like this. Also in E-flat major. You hear the horns in the background, the heroism. So, and so on and so on. And we have to ask ourselves the question, Ein Heldenleben, it means a hero's life. And really, the question is, who is the hero here? Who's he actually writing about? Who's he trying to depict? As I mentioned just a few minutes ago, he wrote pieces on stories like Don Quixote, Don Juan, the legend of Don Juan. But here, critics at the time assumed, and they assumed kind of correctly, that Strauss was writing about himself. And of course, they thought that was a very arrogant sort of thing to do. And Strauss denied it, and also at the same time, he said it's partly true. And we'll find out a little bit more about what makes that partly true in just a moment. So the reason that it starts out just as you heard, and that music is called The Hero. Now, Strauss wrote 6 sections of music in this piece, and he gave them titles depicting what the music is about. However, he didn't want these titles programmed in the music. And so he uses what he learned from Wagner, which is a leitmotif technique. So you'll hear little snippets of music throughout the music that we'll hear, throughout Ein Heldenleben, that will hopefully connect your ear to what is going on in this story or who he's trying to represent. So the music you just heard, and I'll just play it again for a second. So, as I said earlier, that is music of the hero, okay? The second section, and all these sections are sewn together. There are no breaks in this piece. It's purely a tone poem rather than a symphony, as I said. The second movement, I'll play for you. So first you hear these jagged, spiky, chromatic sounds in the woodwinds. And then you hear ba ba bee bum. Well, this music represents critics. And he calls it the hero's adversaries. So the spiky music that you heard represents all his enemies, if you will, in the press. And that little leitmotif you heard, ya ba ba bum, represents one person in particular who was quite hard on Strauss. His name was Herr Dr. Dering, and he was a Viennese critic. And so Strauss memorialized him by writing that motive in the music. And later on, as you'll hear, that music comes back, and the critics get louder and louder and louder until finally you hear a big brass fanfare that completely annihilates them. So the third movement, and I'll just play a little bit of music of the hero again, right? Triumphant. And if you can hear this. Violin Solo. And this violin solo represents someone very autobiographical in Strauss's life. It represents his wife, Pauline. And about her, Strauss had said that she's very complex, a trifle perverse, a trifle coquettish, never the same, changing from minute to minute. And so you hear this music whenever he's in a very, very long, extended violin solo. And it sounds almost as we can hear right now. It sounds like it's punctuated by the orchestra. And in other words, it's like an operatic recitative, where there's a solo line singing away, and the orchestra is playing along with this cadenza, if you will. Much like the Elgar Violin Concerto we heard the other night, where there was accompanied cadenza by the orchestra. You can hear the coquettishness. So, that music represents Pauline, and it segues into this, and I'm going to play this a little bit because this is essentially called the love scene. And this music represents everything I love about Strauss. The violin representing Pauline. I could just listen to this music all day long. This is, I think, what makes Strauss Strauss. First of all, you hear the mastery in this, right? I mean, someone had, what blows my mind still to this day, whenever I hear music by Strauss or Ravel or Mahler, and I think someone had to think of each of these notes and put a pen on a paper, and somehow magically it created that sound you just heard. This lush, sensual, romantic, voluptuous sound. So that is music from the love scene. And naturally, like any good cinematic music, it goes right into music. It's called The Hero at Battle. Offstage trumpets. So you'll see the trumpets get up in the middle of the piece. Off stage to play that fanfare. Now, I wanted to skip ahead in this music and it's going to take me just a second, because as we get more and more into this piece, Strauss starts to quote himself. Talk about cockiness, right? The hero's life. And he gets out of hand in the next movement, but he does this for us. That little horn melody you heard is from Don Juan, from the piece that I referred to earlier. So he's being very self-referential and quoting himself. And like I said, his argument that the piece isn't about him is it's not exactly holding water. But he in the next movement, it's called "The Hero's Works of Peace." And if you thought just one quote was naughty, in this next section, Strauss it starts out as an elegy for the harp and the English horn and the strings, but he quotes an early opera of his 8 times, Don Quixote 5 times, Don Juan 4 times, Death and Transfiguration 4 times, Macbeth 3 times, Also sprach Zarathustra 3 times, Till Eulenspiegel once, and several of his songs. So I think if you're a Straussophile or a musicologist, you might be able to pick all of these out. But even today, as I was in rehearsal, I was noticing some of these and circling them in my score. So again, that music is I'm not going to play any of it for you now, but it's called The Hero's Works of Peace. And lastly, and I'm going to save this for the show as well, but the final section is called The Hero's Retirement from the World and Completion. And again, this is music of Strauss at his very, very best. He finds a way to tie everything together. It's romantic, it's vivid, it's lush, and I think it will leave you all mesmerized. So I'm happy to take any questions if there are any. Yes, sir.
Well, you mentioned words like lush, romantic, sensual, voluptuous. This to me sounds like romantic music earlier in the century. And I happen to like that and I like this. And so I'm puzzled by Schoenberg's statement, which sounds completely different to me. So therefore, that's revolutionary.
Right, it's a great point.
No,
sure. So you have to remember Strauss lived a long life, and this is part of a much larger discussion. But music really didn't implode until World War I. That's really what set it and tore it apart. This piece comes from 1898. Schoenberg was one of the ones, but also Rite of Spring, 1913. In Paris. Paris was also an epicenter of music, as was Vienna, as was Leipzig. Strauss was revolutionary, and you don't hear it perhaps in this music as much as if you were to hear his opera Salome, which explores tonality, he really pushes the boundaries of tonality and cadential music, the ones we might hear or expect from composers like Brahms or Beethoven or Schubert. But that is really where Strauss kind of pushes the edge a little bit. But interestingly enough, many composers kind of moved forward in a certain direction and then they kept going, right? Not Strauss. Strauss went to the edge and then he, in some ways, went backwards. If you were to listen to late Strauss, like the 4 last songs, they sound nothing like his earlier works, like Salome or anything, or Rosenkavalier sounds much more tame than some of the other earlier works. So he kind of went backwards a little bit. I don't say that in a pejorative way. I just think he found a different voice as a mature later composer than the young cocky Richard Strauss. Oh.
So his revolutionary part would be his middle period?
I would say it was, yeah. I would say.
It's early.
Well, no. I think Strauss is, for instance, 1906 is when Salome was performed in Graz, Austria, and at that premiere, it was such a big deal. Gustav Mahler came, Puccini came. They think that Adolf. Well, yeah. So that's kind of when he was revolutionizing and perhaps pushing the boundaries. Still, he hadn't yet, for lack of better wording, gone backwards. So this, this is revolutionary in some ways, but it's not. It's essentially built on Wagner. What we're hearing, this isn't so much different from Wagner, But once you get to Salome, it starts to get out there a little, to say the least. Listen to the Dance of the Seven Veils from Salome, for instance, and that's a different Richard Strauss than even this, or than his late stuff, like the four last songs. So, you have a question, or you just give me time? Oh.
I mean both, but I think someone else had a question.
Oh, another question? He died in 1949 in Bavaria. Strauss was a very wealthy, prominent musician, and I urge you, perhaps, if you're interested, to look into his connections with the Nazis. He didn't necessarily support them, but they gave him the position of essentially music minister of Germany, and he did not turn it down. But at the same time, many people came to his defense and said, well, he had a Jewish daughter-in-law. He was really just trying to protect his family and to stay in Germany. He was a wealthy composer, and after the Allied forces came to Garmisch-Partenkirchen in Bavaria, they came upon his estate, and the U.S. Army went to come and check things out on his property, and he walked down and he said, "I'm Richard Strauss. I'm the composer of Der Rosenkavalier and maybe Don Juan," or whatever he said to them. And so they knew who he was, and so they set up a little guard station in front of his house and made sure that nobody bothered him. But he died in 1949. Yeah. Also, Sibelius is another composer we think of as maybe living a long time ago. Sibelius died in 1957. So that's really not long ago at all when you think about it. So. All right. Well, I hope you enjoy the performance tonight. I know you will. So, all right. Take care.